This is my cartridge of Super Burnout for the Atari Jaguar. And I just got the Atari Jaguar, so I wanted to go and talk about that a little bit first. This is a 64-bit interactive multimedia system. And nothing screams early 90s like the phrase interactive multimedia system. It was Atari's last console and was pretty short-lived. Looking at the control pad, it has one of those number pads like the Intellivision or Coleco. This was retro even at the time. I mean, we're talking 1993 here. Like the Genesis, there are 3 action buttons, and also like the Genesis is the chassis styling, except it's a lot flatter, which I actually really like. It's a very slick console. So let's put in Super Burnout and see what this beast can do. That's quite the introduction, even if the orchestra hit is a bit flat. Super Burnout is a pseudo 3D back-view motorcycle game that plays a bit like Monaco GP on the Genesis. It features several tracks inspired by real-life race courses, and several bikes to choose from as well. And for some reason, the bike select screen is in the options menu. I don't know why they did that. You know, F1 by Dumark also did the same thing. It's a very odd choice, and the menu layout is quite unusual. But what matters is the gameplay, and Super Burnout delivers. The game is just so blistering fast, smooth, and playable that I can overlook its few flaws. So I initially said that this game plays similarly to Super Monaco GP. And what I mean by that is that it's a lap-based racing game where you really need to memorize to some degree the courses. But Super Burnout does something really smart that I don't see a lot of other racers doing. Do you see that oil line in the middle of the road, the darker strip? That oil mark shows the ideal racing line. This is great because although there's a bit of memorization to be had, there's not as much as in similar racers from this era, and that is because you can kind of deduce what the curves are going to do based on how the racing line is acting. For example, if the racing line is all the way to the left, but the curves that are approaching are right-hand curves, you know that the curve can't possibly be all that long, and will likely be followed by a curve going the opposite direction. And this is also helpful because the curves are mean in this game. It's definitely not a racer where you can just floor it around every bend and expect not to fly off the bike. Not only that, but the game demands a good performance from the player. At least if you're aiming for first or second place. In most cases at least. And here's my first beef with the game. I found the skill level for each course to be somewhat inconsistent, at least if you're playing the championship. For example, it starts you off with the America course, which I found to be one of the hardest tracks in the whole game. Add to that a lack of a scoreboard between rounds, and it really starts feeling like the championship mode is an afterthought. Another issue I have with that mode is you can't choose your bike between rounds. In most games this would not be a huge deal, but in Super Burnout, different bikes are much better suited to different kinds of tracks. Super Burnout features 3 different kinds of tracks: technical, semi-technical, and high speed. They could have had you pick one bike for each kind of track, or they could have split the championship into 3 different categories. So I didn't think the championship mode was as playable as it could have been. I usually stick with the default mode, which is called training for some reason. It really should have been called single race mode, which is what it is. But can we talk about the soundtrack? There's just non-stop funk blasting out of this thing. I've got to admit, this is one of my favorite soundtracks in recent memory. And not just because it has orchestra hits and record scratches. No, don't be silly, it also has slap bass. And the funky soundtrack isn't the only touch in this game that I'm a complete sucker for. It also has day and night cycles. So a race might start in the daytime, and as the race goes on, it'll get darker and darker, your headlights will come on, lights in the distance will come on. It's all just gorgeous. Likewise, some races start at night, and the sun comes up as you race. And although these little touches don't fix the broken championship mode, they do show that the game was a labor of love. Speaking of modes, there are two others. There's this time trial mode, which lets you practice a track with no other racers. It also shows you how you're doing relative to the best time for that track. And there's a split screen mode, which unfortunately does not have music or other racers, but it screams along at 60 frames a second, just like the main game, and it looks like a lot of fun. I say looks like because I didn't have anyone handy to play it with me.
Ready, set, go!
I should also mention something quite interesting about the game's development. The game was made by a few French demo sceners who convinced a bigger game company to lend them their Jaguar dev kit on weekends. It's absolutely stunning that an amateur development group making the game on weekends outperformed so many commercial devs on the Jaguar. And this game did get a commercial release, although it came out about 1995, which is a bit late for the Jaguar. I say late for the Jaguar, that's only a year after the Jaguar's wide release. Yeah, the Jaguar didn't do too well. I wonder if it would have done better if it had more games of this quality, you know, as opposed to a Club Drive. Yeah, if you need a good laugh, look up Club Drive, it's not so hot. Luckily, Super Burnout is awesome. It's fun, it plays well, it's groovy, and it's one of those games where I find myself having fun racing the same track over and over, trying to shave milliseconds off my best time. The game is just an absolute joy to play, which makes it easy to forgive its few warts. And it's not just good for the Jaguar, or good for 1995. If an indie game studio released this tomorrow, I'd be pretty thrilled. I'd say if you like old-school lap-based racing games, such as Super Monaco GP, the Lotus series, or Top Gear, you owe it to yourself to check out Super Burnout.
It's a record!